This is how I began my father's eulogy. My father, let's see. There were drug dealers he bailed out, a murderer whose defense he funded, rock and roll bands that got started in his church basements. There were hitters who couldn't hit, fielders who couldn't field, but they all got to play on teams he funded in leagues that he founded. The poor got fed, the lonely got visited, the dying comforted, yes, the lost got found. He played handball with the rabbi. He dated a nun in later widowhood. He debated Muslims before that was a thing. He housed the homeless when that wasn't a popular thing. And he loved the Jehovah's Witnesses whenever they rang the doorbell. That's all true. My father was a bit like a leader, a Pied Piper of young people. He had a tremendous youth ministry, and it wasn't all easy on the hard streets of Brooklyn and Queens in the hard years between the 50s and 80s, amidst gang violence and drug epidemics. He maintained a sunny, positive view of every teenager. He spent tens of thousands of dollars on the futile defense of a youngster in his church who killed another youngster at a party. He lost tens of thousands of dollars when he bailed out two brothers in his church youth group who were busted for selling drugs, and then they jumped bail. There was a rationale behind all of this. My father believed in people, any people, all people. He believed in their innocence, their inner innocence. And he believed that inside everyone was good that was just bursting forth, ready to bloom into beauty. He believed in second chances, third chances, 10 chances. Jesus said to forgive 70 times 7. That's 490, my father used to tell me, and I'm trying to get to 490. Well, I know he reached that magic number, at least with me, and I'm pretty sure he did with a lot of others. But my point is, that was all in a day's work. Church life is anything and everything, for anyone at any time, anywhere. Let me repeat that. Church life is anything and everything for anyone at any time, anywhere. The scripture that we read at the start fits my father to the T. It's St. Paul's advice to a young pastor, Timothy. And Paul said, preach the word, be instant or constant in and out of season, do the work of an evangelist, do all of your duties, keep your head in all situations, fight the good fight, finish the race, keep the faith, take the crown. Tall order, isn't it? Reminds me of that parody of an old adage. Put your shoulder to the wheel, your nose to the grindstone. Keep your feet square on the eye, and keep your eye on the ball. And now try to work that way. But that is a pastor's life when done right. And my father did it right. And so for him, when he got up in the morning, he was a pastor, and when he went to bed at night, he was still a pastor. And in between, everything that he did all day long, all year long, was as a pastor. Now, some of it was the obvious things that you'd be familiar with. He and I went to the same seminary, and they taught us to work hard, very hard on each sermon, up to 20 hours a week on each sermon. Preaching, after all, is an amazing privilege. You give us 20 minutes each Sunday for us to tell you what we believe God wants you to know this particular week. And so it's serious stuff. It's not something you dash off in an hour, and it's not an opinion page. But my father didn't live in his study with his head buried in books, crafting the perfect sermon all week long. No, he walked the streets of his city, visiting the sick, visiting the shut-ins, visiting the hospitals, visiting the prisons, doing funerals, preparing weddings, teaching classes, all the obvious parts of church life. But at the same time, he led meetings of Protestants and Catholics back when Protestants and Catholics didn't think each other were even Christians. He had worship with the local Jewish people in the synagogue back when Christians thought Jews couldn't go to heaven. And when a cross was burned on the front lawn of a new black family in the neighborhood, my father was the first one there. And when Martin Luther King Jr. asked American clergy to leave what they were doing and to get to Selma quick to join his historic march, my father took his first plane ride ever and marched with Dr. King. And when the New York subways went on strike, my father got up at 4 a.m. every day to drive his church members into New York City to work, several rides a day back and forth. He founded and funded sports teams for boys and girls, delivered food door to door to the poor and elderly, and he spoke with public officials about issues that concerned his people. all in a day's work, all being a pastor. Now, many of you, I'm sure, know what the word pastor means. It means shepherd, pastor, pastoral, pasture, pastoral care. It all has to do with the shepherd taking care of the sheep in the most loving and inclusive and protective way. Jesus referred to himself as the good shepherd, and in one of his parables, he talked about the shepherd who gave up everything in order to relentlessly search for and ultimately save the one lost sheep. That was my father as a pastor. For my father, the whole neighborhood, indeed the whole city of New York, was his pastor, and his job was to be the good shepherd no matter who they were or how far off they wandered. It was actually rather straightforward. If you got to do it, you got to do it. That's simple. On Sunday nights, he would go into the Bowery, the old Bowery Rescue Mission, and preach. Or he'd go to Harlem and hear Malcolm X. Or he'd take us all to a church family's house in order to watch Bonanza. It was all ministry to him. Sitting with the church family, watching TV, being with Malcolm X and his followers, preaching the good news to the Bowery bums, as we used to call them. All in a day's work. All ministry. When I was deciding to become a pastor, that was the only model I had. And it looked like a great life to me. Every day is different. Usually every hour of every day is different. And whatever we do for the glory of God, and so it counts. So if you ever wonder what Alita and I do, or why, or how, there is a method to our madness. The method is my father's. The madness is ours. Now let me talk about the Bible. On this day when we made a big deal out of giving our third graders their first Bible, my father's own biblical journey is a good lesson for us. He grew up in a very fundamentalist Christian religion, hellfire and damnation, where the hellfire was really hot and the damnation was forever and reserved for most everybody. The return of Christ to this earth was imminent. People told me that when my grandfather preached, my father's father, when my grandfather preached about Jesus' second coming, half the church was afraid to go outside in case it had happened, and the other half of the church rushed outside hoping that it happened. But the result of such thinking, the reward of heaven for the few and hellfire for the many, the result led to religion solely focused on the individual. Are you saved? Do you know where you're going to spend eternity? All of this was around my father growing up in a little town in rural Maine. My father left Maine for Bible college in Boston and began an interesting transition. It was the early 1940s. World War II was raging. Horrors and atrocities were ravaging the world. Racism and poverty were ravaging his own world. Good and evil were definitely at war wherever he looked. And my father made a decision. He would stand for justice. He would spend less time condemning an individual and more time trying to change the society. He didn't give up on salvation. He just broadened it and expanded it. For him, AA was part of salvation. He had seen the devastation of alcoholism everywhere he went, and so AA was as important to his church life as the altar call had been to my grandfather's ministry. My father had so many AA meetings in his churches that the church hired a sexton just for AA. And for him, keeping kids off the street and occupied and fully engaged and active was part of salvation. I remember for a few years early in my life, he got 5 churches to hire me to do anything I could think to do with kids. Nowadays, if Jesus were to come back today, you couldn't get 5 churches to work together to have a welcome home party for Jesus. But my father could pick pockets of people and churches all over New York City to find the money to help young people, to save young people. And we did it every which way. Sports, films, a coffee house, vacation Bible school, Bible study, dances, worship, trips. Loving your lonely neighbor, that was part of salvation. Feeding your hungry neighbor, that was part of salvation. Reaching across racial barriers, ethnic barriers, economic, religious barriers. Treating people with dignity and respect, that was part of salvation. Now, what I just described is classic post-World War II liberal Protestantism, which, if I may exaggerate a little bit, sidelined Jesus, eliminated God, and skipped over the Bible and ended up becoming irrelevant. All with good intentions. Back in the 1950s, mainline Protestants ruled the roost, especially in the northern part of the United States. Churches dominated the town square. Every town had a church street littered with churches. First Baptist, First Methodist, First Presbyterian, First Congregation, and an Episcopal church there as well, all within a mile radius. Brooklyn, where my father pastored for so many years, was known as the borough of churches on every corner. And so it seemed after World War II it'd be pretty easy. All we had to do was to do good for one another, all together, but not talk about Jesus, not quote the Bible, not mention God. That wasn't my father. He left behind the hellfire and damnation fundamentalism of his growing up, and he embraced the call for the social justice. But he never left behind the Bible. The Bible was his foundation stone. The Bible was the rock upon which he built his life's work as a pastor. He wasn't a slave to it. He wasn't afraid of it. But he could feel God breathing through every part of it, making him willing to wrestle with it and apply it. When he died, my sisters asked if I wanted any of his possessions. Just his Bible, I said. And I had it. Well-worn, well-used, his Bible. The last 2 years of his life, Dad lived in excellent nursing homes in Brooklyn, an Orthodox Jewish Borough Park home and the Norwegian Christian home. Both places of great faith and great care. When we visited him, we'd always see him at a distance before he actually saw us, and sometimes he'd be in the hallway, sometimes in the activities room or the dining room or the patio, sometimes in his own room, always with the Bible open on his lap. Always. And whenever the nurses came to take him somewhere, they'd say, "Do you need anything?" And he'd say, "Just my Bible." For him, the Bible was the beginning of everything. The beginning, not the end. Now, again, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but there are basically two kinds of Christians nowadays. The ones where the Bible is the end. End of discussion, end of thought. And so they've got 3 or 4 verses that supported slavery, 6 or 7 verses that were against homosexuality, a couple of verses telling you to obey your government no matter what, a chapter or 2 predicting the end of the world, 3 or 4 on predestination, and bingo, you're all set. You don't have to think anymore. There's an old saying, the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. Those are the folks for whom the Bible is the end. The other kind of folks are the ones who dismiss the Bible. Oh, good stories, some wisdom in there, a little philosophy, mostly irrelevant, kind of stodgy, ahistorical. Don't bother with it. My father left the first group and he never joined the other group. For him, the Bible was the beginning. That's where you start. It's your grounding. See where it takes you. Let it make your head spin about things. Wrestle with it. Argue with it. Criticize it. Don't be afraid of it. Don't be intimidated by it. Don't worship it. Learn from it. My grandfather began preaching at age 20. He did it for 60 years. He loved the Bible through the prism of the books of Daniel and Revelation. Those are the 2 books in the Bible that tell us most about the end of the world. Judgment Day, hellfire. Now, he was a great pastor and worthy of a whole other sermon. My father loved the Bible through the prism of Jesus, the prophets, and St. Paul. The prophets give us God's bottom line, justice. Do the right thing the right way. Jesus shows us how to do it with an unreachable love and an impossible grace that is actually reachable and actually possible. And St. Paul tells us what church should be, a place where God's justice and Jesus' love get lived out by people who actually dare to believe. He spent 70 years making that happen. My mother died in 1987, and my father lived 31 years with an immense sorrow. Paradoxically, it never left him and yet never paralyzed him, an almost beautiful combination. In these later years, we would talk about dying and death and his funeral and burial, all those things that children of my generation have to pull out of an older generation that really doesn't want to talk about any of that. Old men Mainers just die. They don't talk about dying. They don't plan for it. They don't rush toward it. One day I asked my dad what he believed heaven is. Without hesitation, he said, the place where our fondest hopes are realized. The place where our fondest hopes are realized. And that makes sense. Not just biblically or spiritually, but it feels like perfect symmetry. He spent his whole life trying to help others realize their fondest hopes. And he has eternity now to enjoy his fondest hopes with my mom. We celebrated my dad's 90th birthday right here at Greenfield Hill Church, over in the memorial room, had a big party. And during it, we sang an old hymn from my father's growing-up days in Maine, a hymn about heaven. It's in the back page, back inside page of your bulletin. Next to it is a collage that my sister made about my father's life. You'll see baseball, Bibles, books, my mom, the church, and cat. It really was his life right there. But old Beulah Land, let's have a lot of fun. Sandra's going to bang it out on the piano. How many of you ever went to a revival service? Anybody here? 3 of us, okay. How many of you ever went to a camp meeting? 4 of us, all right, great. So that makes 7 of us that are going to know this hymn, or at least the spirit behind it. Let's stand and have a lot of fun with old Beulah Land.